about the introductory chapter and the papers, and this will be followed by the study area and the context, to be followed by the methods and the data collection which the study carried out and is based upon, and then the theoretical background and the approaches, and then the findings, and then lastly I will conclude. First of all, the problem statement and the justification. The study basically considers the factors that contributed towards the conflict, towards the current conflict in Northwestern Pakistan, and how the application of liberal peace and liberal peace building seeks to address the conflict. As such, it explores the effectiveness of aid programs and livelihood interventions that are carried out under the auspices of liberal peace building in the study area. Long-term sustainability of livelihoods and development opportunities are often seen as contested issues in relation to their practices and how they are carried out in post-conflict affected contexts. So the problem statement basically it also covers issues in relation to early recovery and long-term revivals, and how local perspectives are appreciated as part of these processes, particularly in the Northwestern Pakistan setting. And this is manifested in relation to the 3Ds policy, which the Pakistani state follows in Northwestern Pakistan, and is referred to the Pakistani state. It calls it dialogue, development, and deterrence. The justification of the study. The justification is assessing the gaps between policy and practice and exploring the hindrances in peace-building efforts and the weaknesses in facilitating transitions towards stable societies from conflict-affected contexts. Northwestern Pakistan, particularly, it occupies black hole status in the social science research frontier, since very few empirical studies have been carried out on the area, particularly post 9/11. So the needs for assessing perspectives that are embedded in local contexts, they gain added significance. And like I mentioned, the conflict has made it very, very difficult to carry out field-based research and access local populations in Northwestern Pakistan. The major aim of the study is understanding conflict and how liberal peace addresses it by incorporating local needs and perspectives. It has 5 research objectives, and all those 5 research objectives, they basically form they consist of 3 research questions for each paper and each article which this thesis is composed of. The first objective is to question and to revise the underpinnings of the conflict and how mainstream views influenced by the war against terror they present Pakhtuns to the outside world. The second objective is to examine local perceptions of communities in the study area in relation to the extent to which government claims of support for beneficiaries of humanitarian and development interventions are accepted by communities themselves. The third objective is basically at a macro level. It explores the connections between the liberal peace agenda as promoted by its proposers and proponents and its linkages with the policies and priorities that the Pakistani state pursues in the area. The fourth objective is to explore local perceptions of livelihood crisis in the Swat Valley, which I take a case, and looking at peace-building interventions from NGOs and governments and how they have affected livelihood revivals in the Swat Valley. And then lastly, the thesis explores how and if livelihood interventions they achieve differentiated outcomes in a post-disaster context by impacting livelihoods of poor and vulnerable groups. The thesis, like I said, it has an introductory chapter, and then it is followed by 4 papers and 4 articles. The title of the first paper is Pakhtun Portraits questioning mainstream discourses in post-9/11 Pakistan. The second paper is titled False Promises, False Hopes, Local Perspectives on Liberal Peace Building in Northwestern Pakistan. The third article is titled Local Perceptions of Post-Conflict and Post-Disaster Livelihood Interventions in SWAT, Challenges in Targeting and Sustainability. And the last article is Recovering from Disasters, a Study of Livelihoods in Post-Quake Villages in Northern Pakistan. The study area and the context. Basically, it considered three areas in northwestern Pakistan, including northern Pakistan. Firstly, the Swat Valley, which lies in the central and northern sections in northwestern Pakistan. Then secondly, the Peshawar Valley, which is all this area. So I basically carried out interviews in Peshawar and also in Moman and in Khyber, which house large IDP populations and communities at the time. And then thirdly, it's not visible, but this is Pakistan administered Kashmir, which is attached with the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province in Pakistan. It must be mentioned here that in SWAT I selected households, I selected IDP returnees in relation to the intensity of the villages where they were residing and intensity of the conflict, and then also in relation to the elevations, different elevations throughout the Swat Valley, from the bottom up to the top. The study area, the Swat Valley is a beautiful valley in northern Pakistan, and it's quite famous also throughout the world. The methodology and the primary data collection sources which this thesis relies upon, overwhelmingly, mostly it uses qualitative methodological approaches, and it is based on case studies for each and every paper, which is generally seen as being more useful for studying phenomena associated with social science researches. For paper 2, mostly I also carried out policy analysis of humanitarian response plans and development and peace building strategies that were pursued in northwestern Pakistan. The primary instrument of my interviews with IDP returnees and quake-affected households were semi-structured interviews, and for that I basically utilized a stratified sample for analyzing livelihood revival patterns of both IDP returnees and quake-affected communities. For the program officials and for other respondents and for key informants, I used a convenience and snowball sampling method. This is a table which basically shows I had overall I had 110 respondents, and these are the various classifications: rural, urban, by income group, and in relation to the occupations. So then this is my primary data, but I basically use the primary data respectively for each article. I used a different data set from the whole the whole primary data which I collected. For the first paper, which like I earlier mentioned, is titled Pakhtun Portraits Questioning Mainstream Discourses in Post-9/11 Pakistan, I compared secondary data, including historical accounts of Pakhtuns, and I compared that with the perceptions of Pakhtun key informants through semi-structured interviews and oral histories. The second paper basically relies upon 60 interview transcripts of household informants, mostly from northwestern Pakistan, including SWAT, and also with literature, academic, non-academic newspaper articles, policy statements, government reports, and this is where I basically did a policy analysis, looking at the goals of the strategies in relation to what they had achieved over time. Thirdly, for the third paper, I use key informant interview transcripts and household informant interviews and literature and other humanitarian reports in relation to livelihood recovery, since it is a paper that looks at livelihood recovery of IDP returnees in the Swat Valley. The last paper and the last article, which is titled Recovering from Disasters, a study of livelihoods in post-quake villages in northern Pakistan. The data set which I used was transcripts of interviews with disaster-affected households who were affected from the Pakistan quake of 2005, and how they were reviving their livelihoods through cash grants and credits they had received from humanitarian and development interventions. Now, I turn towards the theoretical background and the approaches which this study uses and utilizes. Firstly, it is based on conflict theory and its relevance towards Pakistan. So what do we mean by conflict? Surke and Chaudhary, they defined a conflict as physical or structural violence that results in breakdown of normal life. The underlying causes of conflicts, they include relative deprivation, social exclusion, horizontal inequalities. All these factors, they contribute towards grievances that often stem from historical development strategies and international policies. And they ultimately undermine the legitimacy of the state and directly impact the social contract between the state and its citizens. So it's important for basically looking at conflicts and considering conflicts, it's important to explore the macro-micro links and how social and development needs and grievances, they ultimately translate into violent forms of discontent. So in this case, it is also important to particularly consider the geographical focus that a particular conflict has in relation to its historical and sociological perspectives. How this is relevant to Northwestern Pakistan and how this contributes to conflict in Northwestern Pakistan. Firstly, governance institutions, they deteriorated in the region, particularly in the late 70s and in the 80s. And they've consequently, the conflict resolution and governance mechanisms, they have even been significantly affected, particularly following post 9/11 intrusions. Secondly, this has decreased conflict management, the capacity of conflict management institutions, which basically is the Jirga system, the Pukhtun Jirga system, which historically provided stability to the society. This, in addition, is also accompanied by structural changes within the Pukhtun society, where the lower lineages and the lower classes, they've basically, in certain instances, they've challenged the higher classes and has also contributed towards a class conflict within the Pukhtun society. Now, secondly, mainstream perspectives on Northwestern Pakistan. The study basically is based on how mainstream perspectives they view Pukhtuns. Mainstream perspectives, they view Pukhtuns and depict them largely as Al-Qaeda sympathizers and as perpetrators of terrorism, extremists and uncivilized. And the unfortunate or the reality of this is that it forms a strong hold in the Western public discourse, including policy documents and including other policies from the United States and other Western engagers in Northwestern Pakistan. So mainstream perspectives, they can basically be understood by analyzing elements such as geographical location and structural determinants of the conflict, which includes history of Talibanization, the ideological, geostrategic and socio-economic aspects which basically surround the conflict. Then understanding indigenous communities, including Pashtuns, that requires placing historical and sociological understandings, particularly those of Pukhtun Wali, which is their social and cultural code. Basically placing it into perspective that can lead to clarifying mainstream perspectives regarding the region. So the mainstream perspectives, they often ignore plausible explanation of the conflict, they ignore Taliban recruitment, they ignore political and geostrategic dimensions, which are central towards understanding this conflict. They have been deconstructed by certain individuals and researchers such as Taj, Rofran, Levin. However, there is a greater room in this area, and this is something which this study basically deals with. Reasons why mainstream perspectives they remain so popular in the area, they include difficulty in accessing the area, since it is an active conflict zone, and it is also the military and other actors, they often keep a lid on things, and they also control how information goes out from Northwestern Pakistan. And in such a way, these perspectives, they facilitate continued conflict and lack of accountability in relation to the present conflict. Then the drone strikes and the drone programs, which basically alienate local populations, these perspectives, they also, in a way, are favorable towards the drone program because there is a lack of accountability. Thirdly, the liberal peace agenda and the development discourse on post-conflict rebuilding. So, like I mentioned earlier, that every human being has an affinity towards equal rights. Liberalism and countries that subscribe to liberalism and liberal thinking is based on the stated premise that liberal thinking and liberal societies never go to war. The stated goals of it includes promoting democracy, market-based economies, and peaceful societies, thereby contributing towards international security. And then the whole arrangement that donor countries carry out in managing conflicts, emphasizing reform of institutions, governance, and development interventions. And liberal peace building, it often sees short-term interventions as effective instruments in post-conflict societies. And this is what is striking to note is that it took Europe and Western societies many centuries to embrace the ideals of liberalism. So in such a way, the liberal peace discourse in post-conflict areas, it negates the very basis of liberalism in the West. Understanding liberal peace, it requires analyzing and assessing the underlying motives behind policies, power structures, hidden agendas, and interests. And this particularly relates to Iraq and Afghanistan that were framed in the language of bringing freedom and democracy. There are a number of contradictions that basically entails liberal peace building in conflict-affected states and societies. Firstly, it is unable to build up local institutional capacities. It ignores the underlying sources of conflicts. It leads to divisiveness and increased turmoil. And also, it contributes to what is called more harm than good. A plausible explanation of these inconsistencies, they include dominance of conservative approaches, reliance on military means, and alienation of local population and communities. Now, the study also, it looks, the theoretical aspects include, the theoretical literature includes impacts of livelihood interventions with reference to conflict and disaster contexts. So firstly, livelihood approaches, they are seen as complex strands that revolve around people's efforts to achieve and sustain adequate standard of living. Livelihood programs, in such contexts, they boost household entitlements and livelihood recovery. Household livelihoods with reference to conflict-affected contexts, they are often categorized by displacements, forced migration, losses, and depletion of livelihood assets. What is interesting basically to explore is the policies and practices influencing livelihoods, which ultimately have top-down and bottom-up linkages in relation to their success. Livelihood programs in conflict, in post-conflict and disaster contexts, they support vulnerable groups, and they often require investments across different sectors, including health, education, infrastructure, amongst others. Challenges for livelihood interventions basically mostly include incorporating both relief and development modes of operation and how they are able to consult beneficiaries in conflict-affected contexts. Because this is important, because meeting local needs is central and it determines success or failure of interventions, and it is also tied towards success and failure of liberal peace building. Now I come to the findings of the papers. The first paper, basically the findings of the first paper include that mainstream perspectives on Pashtuns, they undervalue historical geopolitical dimensions of the current conflict. The current mainstream perspectives, they negate the accounts that were presented by British colonialists on Pashtuns, who regarded Pashtuns as a martial race and pursued a closed border policy in the area. Thirdly, Pashtun social structures, they have been affected by instabilities that reduce adherence to their social code, which is the Pashtun value. Adherence to the Pashtun values, like I mentioned earlier, because of the changed dimensions in the area in the 80s, senior lineages like Khans, they lost out their clout and influence, and as such there was divergence between the various institutions within the Pashtun society that included a power shift from the Hujra to the mosque. And then lastly, over-reliance on military force that has caused tensions within the tribes, and that has basically affected the fabric of the society. The second paper, False Promises, False Hopes, Local Perspectives on Liberal Peacebuilding in Northwestern Pakistan. The findings include responses to the conflict in the area, which are mostly carried out under the Liberal Peace Framework. They aim to achieve peace through humanitarian and development interventions. Some of these plans are, like, for instance, the Post-Crisis Needs Assessment, the Pakistan Humanitarian Response Plan, and the Floods Emergency Response Plan. These plans and these initiatives, they are often projected by their proposers and their promoters as groundbreaking, and they are often laced with promises. However, achievements of these plans, they have been limited in scope. Why have their achievements been limited in scope, and why they have failed to target local communities include weaknesses in the implementation of these strategies and policies. The paper, it locates the institutional factors and weaknesses in relation to the overall Liberal Peace Framework, and how it is connected to its promoters, including the US, and how they mismatch with the needs of local communities. And it identifies how this is part of a larger problem, which relates towards contradictions in the Liberal Peace agenda, undermining local agency, creating dependencies, decreasing institutional capacities in conflict-affected contexts, including Northwestern Pakistan. Empirical evidence from the region, it indicates that peace-building, development and security are strongly linked to security discourses, which of course is connected with the conservative forms of liberal peace approaches. And the biggest consequence has been that this has led to securitization of development, following in relation to the post-crisis development and post-humanitarian interventions that have been carried out in the region. The third paper, which is titled Livelihood Recoveries, a study of Pakistan's conflict-affected Swat Valley. It explored how livelihood projects in Swat were actually carrying out relief and rehabilitation activities, and even in certain instances, they were basically distributing WASH, which stands for Water, Sanitation and Health Facilities, towards local communities, which they had basically categorized as livelihoods interventions. So there has been a failure in relation to these interventions, and they failed to effect long-lasting impacts in relation to livelihoods of conflict-affected communities. Issues in this connection, they included a lack of coordination between the different institutional actors in Swat, and also, in addition, there were short-term distributions and relief activities, and this is also something which is connected with the Liberal Peace Framework, which often sees short-term interventions as their primary vehicle in conflict-affected societies. So the paper, it identified the weaknesses in the institutional context, and the evidence from Swat basically is that longer-term development actors, which in the case of Swat was the Planning and Development Department for the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, it was absent in the area, and it was not given sufficient space, and it was not provided funding opportunities. The fourth paper, it explored livelihoods of post-quake communities in villages in northern Pakistan. The paper, it identifies the structural aspects and working strategies of 4 different types of livelihood schemes and identifies how they supported livelihoods of beneficiaries. The paper, it identifies households in 2 villages in relation to vulnerable and poor categories. These individuals, in most cases, they availed opportunities and moved towards favorable livelihood outcomes, basically moving on to middle income or poor income groups from vulnerable and poor income groups between June 2006 and October 2008. The post-disaster context in Northwestern Pakistan, looking at the whole study, the post-disaster context in Northwestern Pakistan, it enabled generally the institutional context, it supported adequate targeting of livelihood initiatives that resulted in sustainable livelihoods for communities in the quake-affected areas. In comparison to the households in Swat. And then, lastly, the paper it gains an appreciation of differentiated livelihood outcomes in relation to structural aspects, working strategies and key factors, and strengths of 5 livelihood schemes. The overall conclusions of the study. Firstly, mainstream discourses on Pashtuns, they encourage protracted conflict in northwestern Pakistan. Secondly, Pashtun social structures, they witnessed changes in the last 4 decades that have affected the ability of Pashtun customary structures to manage conflicts and have led to power shifts within the Pashtun society. The third paper, it explored development and humanitarian response plans in Swat, in northwestern Pakistan, and it basically assesses how some of these plans, they are unable to affect long-term peace building, which is basically a problem signifying problems within the liberal peace framework. The fourth conclusion is that empirical evidence from northwestern Pakistan, it indicates that security considerations, they often outweigh needs of local communities in the northwest. That is the third conclusion. And then for the fifth conclusion is basically that livelihood interventions in Swat, they failed to support livelihoods of conflict-affected communities because of issues with targeting and sustainability. Sixthly, in relation to post-disaster livelihood schemes in Swat, how there were problems with the sense of lack of clarity and how the post-disaster livelihood interventions in Pakistan administered Kashmir, they were well-directed and enabled livelihood revivals in relation to IDP returnee communities in Swat. Lastly, poor and household and vulnerable households, they utilized cash transfers and managed to move to favorable outcomes and no longer relied on arms and other forms of community support. Thank you very much.
So that you can get him and him.
Oh yeah, like this?
No, yeah, exactly.
First, thank you very much for this opportunity to come and discuss such interesting issues as we laid out on the table today. Just to inform, because our 2 of us who are going to oppose the presentation, we have divided the task a bit about yourself, so you're informed about that. I will primarily look at the theoretical backgrounds of things, and then go into articles 1 and 2, because they're very interconnected. Then our learn from here will go more into the methodology and the 2 last articles. So there might be some overlap, but we hope that that also then enables us to bring up a lot of scope of questions. Can I ask the administrator just to let us know 10 minutes before we are finalized if we engage very much in the discussions. Let us start with the theory, because as you presented the thesis and as you presented now in the trial lecture, we're using the term liberal peace. Well, the title of your thesis is Peacebuilding, not Liberal Peacebuilding. And I'd like us to dwell a bit on this, because the term peacebuilding was introduced by the UN. You have a small reference to it in your thesis. The agenda for peace, and then later on the establishment of the Peacebuilding Commission. And some of the, and as such, it came before the two real crises that you refer to, Iraq and Afghanistan, that then somehow you were using for your description of the building peace. But if you look at the definition of peace building, it's rather similar to the kind of definition you use for the liberal peace. It says that it should involve a full range of approaches, processes and stages needed for transformation towards more sustainable, peaceful relationship and governance modes and structures. And it says that it includes building legal and human rights institutions, as well as fair and effective governance and dispute resolution processes and systems. And it says to be effective, peace-building activities require careful and participatory planning, coordination among various efforts, and sustained commitment of both local and donor partners. This is a quote from the original document by Boutros Ghali. So I'd like you to expand a bit on your presentation, disentangle a bit more the difference between the liberal peace building and the peace building, because somehow I'm seeing that you are using this as one part of the definition of the liberal peace building. But what would you say by using this definition is the main difference how you see liberal peace building and how you see peace building?
In relation to the thesis, how I use it basically is, since your development and humanitarian interventions, they form the basis of peace building in Northwestern Pakistan. So that is why I'm using a general term peace building, which is basically encompassing both development and humanitarian interventions. And since the liberal peace framework is most notable in Northwestern Pakistan, and the whole framework is applied by funders and by funding agencies and by bilateral donors and others. That is why when I use peace building, I'm referring to the types of interventions carried out under liberal peace in Northwestern Pakistan. But you're referring to the definitional aspects.
What would you see as the main differences if you use them, the original term for peace building, and what you define as the liberal peace building? What would be the main differences?
Like I said, as far as my understanding of liberal peace is concerned, liberal peace, basically, the definitional aspects, even the conservative approaches, basically, the stated aim over there is basically equality, human rights, and even, supporting communities. But the difference lies between how they are practiced in conflict-affected societies. And maybe that is also what the liberal peace theorists, including Richmond and others, that is what they base their critique upon. But I generally would feel that liberal peace and peace building, in relation to definitional issues, they should be the same. They would be pretty much the same, because even you referred to the UN Commission, and that is also basically a central aspect of the liberal peace strategy, from what I've read through in the literature. That is also basically connected, most authors, they connect that to liberal peace building approaches.
Well, I would say that there is two major differences. I would say that the liberal peace approach, as you presented here, is also about the use of military force. If you take Iraq and Afghanistan as part of a peace-building strategy, while the UN approach is more the use of peacekeeping forces. So you go more aggressively in the use of force. I see also, at least for both Iraq and Afghanistan, there is much more talk about economic liberalization, a smaller state, in one way. So to me, there are two things that seem somehow to separate these two concepts. And this is important to me because I'm not really sure if the UN in Pakistan or in Afghanistan would subscribe to being part of a liberal peace building, I'm sure they will subscribe to be part of peace building. And that gives them, I'll come back to some of this discussion, because I think for some of these things that you could have benefit on hang a bit more, because I think you group together some of the terms, and then also in some of the actors, to an extent that makes the analysis a bit different. But I'll come back to that. But just ask, because if you then take my definition, would you see all actors in Pakistan, because you listen as the UN, the World Bank, the international NGOs, the donors, would you see them as part of the liberal peace building agenda, or could you see that some of them have a different
agenda? The way I've used it, and the way generally the liberal peace framework in conflict-affected societies, it basically means, where outside actors, they come in, and by outside actors you basically associate everybody into the same league. So the way they come in with their funding resources and with their implementation arrangements, and the way they carry out, in most cases, humanitarian interventions, in some cases also development aspects. So that is how I would see, and that is also generally true for Northwestern Pakistan, because there are different plans. There are different plans, but there is some variation among some of the actors, particularly the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. They look at things slightly differently. They look at through, like you mentioned, they look through a long-term perspective, which maybe the UN and particularly bilaterals, they ignore.
Good. And just a continuation of that, because some of the last slides you show here, you said all the failures that somehow you associated with the liberal peace agenda as those for implementation of aid efforts, humanitarian assistance, recovery and development and sport. Sport is a bit special because there was mainly Pakistani military fighting there. It was not so much an international intervention. But we could end up back to where
like I said, naturally it contributes positively towards international security and peace. Developing countries in the South, they are often seen by countries in the West where liberal ideas and liberal peace building gained its roots. They are often seen as more susceptible to conflict because they are seen as having institutions and societies which necessarily don't lead to equality and don't safeguard fundamental human rights. So in a conflict-affected context, liberal peace building would naturally involve donor strategies that would seek transformation in relation to economic, political liberalization of those areas. Development assistance in conflict-affected areas, it often reduces incidences of civil war in relation through application of economic aid, military and political measures. The approach is also connected to the Winning Hearts and Minds campaign, which basically emphasizes winning hearts and minds of populations in conflict-affected areas. And naturally, through this approach, it seeks to keep incidences of radicalism and extremism in check. This primarily relates to Iraq, Afghanistan, and also other countries. And I'm quoting here Fisher, Hoffman, Richmond, and others. The other aspect of liberal peace is that it often leads to simplistic notions and linkages between conflict and development. It looks at conflict and it looks at the development discourse often looks at post-conflict rebuilding in terms of linear strategies such as clear, hold, build, and transfer. The development aspect, it includes a stated aim to secure livelihoods of conflict-affected population. The World Bank, it is one of the primary institutions which deals with conflict-affected areas, and it basically sees development as an instrument for conflict-affected regions to escape the conflict trap. Examples of liberal peace building, they include countries and cases such as Bosnia, Rwanda, Kosovo, and East Timor, where they've been practiced to a relative degree of success. The different types, now we come to the different types and the different manifestations of liberal peacebuilding. Liberal peacebuilding is basically categorized in relation to conservative, orthodox, and emancipatory graduations and types within the liberal peace framework. For example, Richmond, Goodhand, and Newman, they basically categorize liberal peace according to the practices it carries out in conflict-affected societies. Firstly is the conservative approach. The conservative approach to liberal peacebuilding, it basically involves application of military force in conflict-affected societies. And it's a top-down approach towards peacebuilding and development. It is based on coercive means and is often seen as hegemonic and is sometimes seen as using force and by application of conditionalities and dependencies. The World Bank and the US led unilateral state-building efforts in countries such as Iraq, Afghanistan, amongst others. They are often charged with implementing a conservative form of liberal peace in these areas. And it is often seen as leading to militarization of peace, and in its severe form, it is often seen as leading to a hyper-conservative model, which is informed by the victor's peace, and which basically involves subduing its opponents, primarily in Iraq and also in Afghanistan. We've seen that for the last 10-11 years. Then secondly, the orthodox model. The orthodox model of liberal peace, it is in relation to the conservative model, it is sensitive to local ownership and culture, but it is still determined to transfer the methodologies, objectives, and norms of liberalism, which is the liberal society, into conflict-affected contexts through the liberal peace framework. It is, however, seen as being more balanced, multilateral, and state-centric peace, and it is led by the United Nations and international organizations and the INGOs, which often operate alongside the UN in post-conflict contexts. It represents both bottom-up and top-down approaches, and examples include East Timor, South Sudan, and other African countries and contexts. Examples of the orthodox model basically are predominantly they're related to the UN's families of practices of peacebuilding and governance, which basically started following the Cold War, following the end of the Cold War, and has culminated in sovereignty of the UN over East Timor. It must be pointed out over here that both the conservative and the orthodox approaches towards liberal peacebuilding, they assume a technical superiority of the promoters and of the funders of liberal peace towards its subjects in conflict-affected contexts. Then thirdly, the emancipatory model of liberal peace. The emancipatory model of liberal peace, it is basically based in consent and greater local ownerships of liberal peacebuilding and of approaches towards post-conflict development in conflict-affected societies. The emancipatory model is mostly critical of coerciveness and conditionalities and dependencies, which, like we explained earlier, in the conservative model and in the orthodox model, are a dominant feature. The emancipatory model, unlike the other two models, it is based mostly in bottom-up approaches, and it is enshrined in needs-based activities and stronger concerns for social justice. In emancipatory contexts, the INGOs and state donors, it must be mentioned, are not as assertive as they are particularly in the orthodox case. Examples of emancipatory model in contemporary settings are few, but they include cases such as Kosovo, which is slightly different than other post-conflict and post-conflict contexts. Now, liberal peacebuilding in conflict-affected contexts. Firstly, it is clear that different versions of liberal peace, including conservative, orthodox, and the emancipatory models, they contradict and undermine each other. Most contemporary peace building, they are largely placed between the conservative and the orthodox approaches. The different promoters of the liberal peace, like we mentioned earlier, the UN, the US, and the NGOs. The UN out of this basically focuses mostly on the orthodox model, which is both bottom-up and top-down. And it also provides the United Nations with much legitimacy, which it often requires in conflict-affected contexts. The US, in relation to its practices, has mostly been concerned with the application of conservative models, and also it funds the orthodox graduations within the liberal peace framework. It must, however, be mentioned that the United States remains the greatest contributor in relation to financial means for funding the liberal peace agenda. Lastly, the NGOs, they mostly tend to focus on the orthodox models, as well as major donors such as Britain, France, Canada, Japan, and Norway, which basically are mostly tailored towards orthodox approaches, and also in some cases they shore up emancipatory tendencies within conflict-affected societies. Now, after giving you an overview of liberal peace building, the definitions, and how it is relevant to conflict-affected societies, now I will try to deal with the Pashtun society and unpack the particular context of this lecture. The Pashtun society, it's basically Pashtuns, they are referred to as the largest tribal and segmented lineage society in the world, according to Lindholm. Maintenance of ethnic identity, it remains a central goal for Pashtuns, and they are identifiable in relation to their tribes, sub-tribes, and other lineages to the very bottom. The Pashtun society, the Pashtuns, they basically inhabit western sections and western areas on the Indus River in Pakistan. And they subscribe to customary structures and social codes, most notably the Pashtun Wali, which encompasses their cultural and social aspects of life. And this also enables differentiating the Pashtuns from non-Pashtuns within Pakistan and also in Afghanistan. The Pashtun Wali, which is their social and cultural code, it basically has three pillars. Firstly, manhood. Secondly, honor. And thirdly, matters relating to social order and households, including land and financial settlements. The jirga, it is a central pillar of the Pashtun society because it is a governance mechanism, and in addition to being a governance mechanism, it is a conflict resolution mechanism which basically deals with conflicts between individuals and also between ethnic groups and sub-ethnic groups in the Pashtun areas. The Pashtun social order, it is divided into four factions. Firstly, the Khans, who are also the landlords. Then the tenants, who basically till the lands for the Khans. And then thirdly, the Kasabgars, which is the working class. And lastly, the Maulvis, who basically belong to the religious clergy. The government of Pakistan in the Northwest has historically solicited support from the Jirgas throughout its history for dealing with conflicts and for matters in relation to day-to-day affairs. However, in relation to the Pashtun society, it is central that social structures in the area, they started experiencing changes in the late 70s and in the early 80s, particularly because of the war in Afghanistan, when the region was used as a launching pad and as a base to carry out activities in neighboring Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. Here's a map of northwestern Pakistan. The white includes the federally administered tribal areas, and this is basically the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, which basically consists of which compose northwestern Pakistan. Northwestern Pakistan is different than other areas of Pakistan because it basically has experienced and continues to experience three different types and forms of governance systems. Firstly, it has settled districts, which, like other areas and other districts of Pakistan, are similar to other areas. Secondly, the provincially administered tribal areas, which lie between the settled districts and the federally administered tribal areas. And then thirdly, the agencies in FATA, which basically are districts in FATA, and they follow tribal forms of governance and are directly administered under the president through his agent, who is the governor. Characteristics of the area, they include a historical neglect of the area, and which also these different types of governance system, it is pretty evident that it manifests a lack of coherence of the Pakistani state in meeting the governance challenges in the northwest of the country. Now, the current context of Northwestern Pakistan, the important aspects. First of all, it has undergone a protracted conflict. Secondly, it was also affected by a super flood, which has basically led to serious repercussions for communities in the area. Just to say a few, the industrial units in Northwestern Pakistan, they decreased between 2000 and 2009 from 3,500 to 600. And it must be appreciated that in the same period, the population probably increased by a third. So you can assess the problems which the local communities have had to face in terms of access of jobs and employment opportunities, and also loss of their livelihoods. Then there has been, like I said, a huge flood, and the losses of the flood, they amount to $1.17 billion US. The conflict damages for infrastructure alone are estimated to be $0.87 billion, which are basically in addition to those of the floods. So these things, they give you an insight. These are some of the features to a certain degree, because crucial infrastructure needs, which are very central, they have not been met even now. And now is basically 4 years following the displacement crisis and 3 years following the floods.
I'm just asking because I hear that criticism very frequently for any kind of assistance program, that they don't take account for this. And so I just wonder on this factor of the liberal peace that you're putting into, if it really does make a difference. If it makes anything bad, worse, or if it makes anything bad.
If you implement it differently, is that what you mean?
Yeah.
If you implement it differently, of course, things can improve. Yeah, there is room for protection, but right now, and this is the inherent problem with liberal peace, that it in a way it encourages dependencies and short-termism, etc., in these societies, because the way they go about things, maybe the agenda is not to improve the quality of life and to revive communities in themselves. Maybe, I'm just posing a question.
Maybe the same as development assistance in the case. But let's move on. There is one field that I had expected that you had covered more with the issue of gender. And also because the role of women is so important on the peacebuilding agenda. So when I look through the theory part of it, you haven't mentioned it at all. When I look through how you are referencing female informants at 94, for all those who have used. So I will challenge you a bit more on how you actually, more on the theory side, what could be the potential role of women on a peacebuilding agenda? Just to think about that, that's the first part of it. And then from your research, will you bring out more actual information on the role of women, both in the recovery process and also then towards peacebuilding? This is your golden opportunity to...
In relation to women, I agree that I interviewed, comparatively, there are quite few. Now, I don't remember the exact number, but maybe
24.
Something like that, yeah, 24.
Okay.
But of course, that also signifies that, especially when I was carrying out my fieldwork initially in 2010, in October 2010, there were lots of restrictions in Assault Valley. So it was basically difficult to get in and access and talk with anybody. And then but I would agree that they should have been covered more. But under the existing circumstances, I still managed to interview 24, and that's towards the end. So,
my friend, there was no restriction on access to literature on women in peacebuilding, was there?
I agree with that. I agree with that. But that is an aspect which maybe I should, in the future, if I have an opportunity, I would like to revisit. But as a whole, the existing topic which I had and the existing scope which I had, that was quite enough, and that was difficult to cover. So,
but honestly, I would say that women play such an important role in thinking about the whole peacebuilding agenda. Much of the literature actually is focused on failures of peacebuilding because of the lack of inclusion of women. So, and in particular when it comes to the areas that is research, I would have actually welcome more of the reflections on that.
Yeah, I did use women's perspectives. I used many women respondents in relation to how they received support from humanitarian and development intervention. And I had target groups and focus groups with them. So we did try to cover some aspects, but I looked at them generally, and I haven't tried to differentiate. That is something which I would agree.
But let me bring in an example from my own research, because looking after the earthquake back in 2005, actually I found, and those working with me, found that it was primarily women who were located in those villages didn't have earthquakes, because most of the men were working in southern parts of Pakistan. And that actually had the women forced to take on the role which usually was filled by the men. And to me that brought up a lot of discussion, because then they had to take on these tasks, there was no way around it. How did society learn from that? Whether they could do it, whether given a larger role in these kind of plans afterwards, or those kind of processes where the support Stockholm community, how does that then change the community's ability to appreciate women's role? Have you any similar experiences? Because
in SWAT, basically, because it was a conflict-affected context, so basically the men were fighting, and then a Pakistan society, like it or not, it is a conservative society. So the role of the woman is like outside the house, it's limited. But they did play an important role. And also from my work in Kashmir, I saw that as well. That even maybe like you were mentioning, you can maybe attribute the success of livelihood initiatives in villages in Kashmir towards the engagement of women. Because I saw many females basically getting lots of loans and lots of cash grants and lots of other opportunities, and they established viable businesses in Kashmir, and that was basically a fundamental difference. And that is also why, as a whole, the economies in Kashmir, they were far better. Like the relative improvement in the economies over there was more than in Swat.
But then if you take one step back and reflect on what you said now, the differences you see in different parts of the area that you have studied. Is there anything from this that then you can bring into the theory on women's role in recovery and peacebuilding?
Yeah, of course, women, they are 50% of the total group, so if they are not participating, there can't be changes. And so, of course, it's a central aspect, and it's a central target group. And potentially, like Pakistan society, they have to open up, like in the future, because unless they are based on this segment of the society, and unless they can involve that segment of the society properly, things won't be good. But yeah.
If we move on, there's then a third element that I like to bring up for discussion with you, and that is you're somehow, I would say that you are somehow underestimating the role of researchers that is not from the given area. Or to put it in another way, you are placing actually an emphasis saying that you have to be from a particular area to actually conduct research in those areas. And I find that rather problematic. For different reasons, looking to this continuity, because you more or less are rejecting some of those who have done a lot of research in some of the areas. And then I'm thinking, is it because of they as a person, or is it because of their skills as academics and their ability to reflect on situations in those areas? That's one question I think I'd like you to elaborate a bit more on, because is this based on scientific evidence, or is it based on your judgment of them as not being from the area? And then the second, which I think is important for our discussion on the literature, how do you then relate to these sources that you somehow reject and still use very largely in your literature?
Firstly, maybe it's the way I put it. Of course, external researchers, they have a very important role to play because, they enable reflexiveness and, basically locals to look through upon, from another perspective. So they play an important role, but the way I've used it and maybe the way I wanted to refer to it basically was because, sources from within Pakhtun society, they are also undervalued and they are also non-existent in the existing literature. That I find it difficult, I find it reasonably difficult to comprehend how only non-Pakhtuns they will comment on their social structures without experiencing at first hand, and that is something also which is visible in some of the writings. But and I'm not basically saying that myself, but I look through different sources within the Pashtun society, and quite a few literature sources, and there was a unanimity that indigenous views as promoted by indigenous researchers, they play a central aspect in basically breaking down both the Pashtun society, their cultural and social codes, as well as in relation to the conflict, the current conflict which is taking place in the region. So that is why maybe, but
then two questions. How have you weighted these literature sources when you are assessing the kind of literature you have been through? Because you are not making any kind of disqualification, you are using them quite extensively. But how have you been thinking about them if you, from the outside, don't think of them as valuable in other sources?
I've not been using all sources. I refer to maybe Rashid, and maybe that is also whom you are referring to.
No, you referenced several. Levin is British source.
But Levin I don't criticize. And it's basically not me criticizing, I'm using the critiques of others on Rashid. So I haven't criticized it myself, but I'm sourcing that criticism for some other advance.
It's not very clear that it's not your criticism.
They could have,
someone who is not from the area, grown up in the religious land, you go quite in details in saying that. I think this is a major challenge, because it questions some of the assumptions that you make later on. Do you trust these sources? Do you build on them? Or do you really question them?
Yeah, but if you, I would just like to add a bit here. But if you look at Rashid's, writings, most of his writings, he says that Pakhtuns are cave-like communities, and cave-like communities or mountain communities, and they are like there is no possibility of conflict transformation if you speak to those guys. And the unfortunate aspect over here is that he's considered an authority. Then there are a few others, and I would not like to name them because it doesn't look good. But this is something which I wanted to bring into the literature and into the research. That if you fail to look at local perspectives, if you fail to look at things, in a way so as to encourage conflict, transformation, or peacemaking, you won't be able to look at reasons behind the conflict.
If you don't move on, and some of the other part of the literature that we're using, I will focus a bit on Donini, as you might have noticed in my comment as well. But before that, I think in general, there are a number of references that could have been used in a better way, including Glatzer, that passed away. But you were referencing him back in 1998 for a kind of evidence for things that happened in 2004. He might have written things later on that could have been much more relevant, actually, for what we have to discuss. So there are some of these issues where I think you should take again a critical look on how you apply references. And one of them is actually Anthony, because you're using very extensively and in different ways throughout different chapters, quoting him both on peace building, but then also on the local perspectives. As I'm reading Bernini, and I've discussed a lot with him, he is critical and he is referencing to the liberal peace agenda. But his main concern is that some parts, as he said, of the humanitarian enterprise is increasingly part of the process of global governance. So that is his main criticism, more than on the peace agenda. And the perception, as you also touch upon, on the role of humanitarian agencies is his main concern. And as such, in that respect, it's very relevant that we draw on it. But then, again, relating to Domini, because he's really talking about Afghanistan. And you are using several sources relating to Afghanistan in your thesis. So I'd like just to ask, how do you look upon this? Can things really be transferred from the experience in Afghanistan to Pakistan, given that there is somehow a very different military situation in Afghanistan than to find, and also a different situation for humanitarian agencies? Can you just reflect a bit on that?
When I'm using Dunini, I'm basically looking at, like you said yourself, that I'm considering humanitarian interventions in Afghanistan, which Dunini uses. But I'm basically using it because, like I said earlier, that Northwestern Pakistan, there have been very few researches, particularly, on humanitarian issues. You would hardly find, there are very few. There might be a few, but there are few. So, of course, you need to draw upon someone's work, and you also need to draw upon, if I'm looking at humanitarian interventions in Northwestern Pakistan, so I can at least draw on some of the weaknesses and the key issues which Dunini found from Afghanistan, and overall Afghanistan is also a Christian society. So, there is some, but there is some, in a way, there is overlap in that sense as well. That Afghanistan is a Christian society, Northwestern Pakistan is a Muslim society, and then largely, basically, the humanitarian responses and the development plans, they are, they follow almost the same strategies, the same plans, and the same methodologies, which largely. So you can draw parallels if you use that work, and especially if there hasn't been any research before in Northwestern Pakistan. You have to look at through somebody else's work in similar contexts.
I thought there had actually been more work on the situation in Scotland, because it's more accessible, and also other parts of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa.
There are a few, but they don't really dig in deep. Like there is Saira or Exain, there are a few others, there is Ahmad, and some of those I basically draw upon my work. In my work, I've referred to them and I've looked through them. But the problem is that they haven't really dug up deep, and they haven't really, analyzed many respondents. And that is something which I think is very important in the context of development studies, and also if you are carrying out longer term research, which is, but I have read through as much as I could have.
Good. I will go into an area that is not my main field, but I got a bit intrigued in the way you present the things, both in the thesis and also here today. That goes for this with the Pashtuns and governance, to use that term. Because the way I read you argue that the traditional way of Pashtun governance and conflict resolution, as you mentioned with Pashtun Valley and Jirga, is a kind of ideal for Pashtuns. And you're not saying that it's an ideal for anybody else, but it's an ideal for Pashtuns. And that you then contrast this positively up against the way that the government of Pakistan and the international community then has ideally imposed a new set of governance and structures on the Pashtuns. But then I'm getting a bit puzzled, because I think you can use this argument against the international community, of course, and against the government of Islamabad. But can you use it against your local administration in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa? Can you use it against all those Pashtuns being elected into as a parliament that is defined in Punjab? These are Pashtuns that have to combine Pashtun Valley with the role in the Pakistani state apparatus. Are they not able to think two things at the same time? Are they not able actually to combine these things? Are they giving up their Pashtun values? some discussion on the conference. I'd like to hear you.
I agree with your statement, but how I would see it is, in North, particularly, the Pakistani state allows very limited autonomy to the provinces, and that is also the case with Khyber Pakhtunkhwa.
But didn't that change with the last amendment that was actually delegating much more authority?
The last amendment, in theory, it promises much, but unfortunately, we had an administration which wasn't, very transparent. And in my opinion, and maybe that is also what generally Pashtuns would feel, that they couldn't draw a lot of autonomy, and also they couldn't basically. This is something which you're very right to say that they should have been able to deal with this locally. But the problem is, again, they didn't have the resources and they maybe didn't have the will. And that has changed with the recent elections. Like you see the slide, because the last parties who were sitting in the provincial legislature in Peshawar, none of them, ANP, only they won one seat. Maybe last time they had 50. So that shows, the way people have responded. Because people have also in local communities have said that, enough is enough. And we need accountable people over here who can take care of the problems and who can take care of the conflict.
But they are still persons in their positions in the state administration and in the parliament. So why don't they apply more than what you value as the personal social code? Because they don't change overnight, even if they join the parliament.
Yeah. In addition, I would like to point out that this is the Pakistani military, which basically controls the situation and which keeps things under lid in the country and particularly in Northwestern Pakistan. So so it's sort of a gray area because there was an elected government, and so they don't have the security and foreign policies. They're basically pursued and they are propagated by the military. So that is also one key issue, and then that was the bilateral arrangement between the military and the United States to keep the status quo and to pursue a drone campaign and that they will keep their eyes shut and things like that. But like what you're saying, it's very relevant because right now is the chance, and probably things will improve in those aspects.
How much time do we have? Because I have two minor questions, and then I'll take those as well. Because this goes into the analysis of why it became so a conflict within these areas, what you just spoke about. And what you define as a negative development of the border areas. One thing you say is that the erstwhile Mujahideen, and then we are talking about the 1980s when we used that definition issue, were not integrated into the society. But really, how many Pakistanis were fighting in Afghanistan at that time? Were there that many that were not integrated that it really could make a difference on the security situation? I would argue that the instability caused by Afghan refugees might have been much more than the lack of integration of Pakistani nationals. But that's meant to be corrected.
Both these factors are critical, because there were a lot of Pashtuns who fought in the war. I don't remember the figures, but what I've heard is every village there were maybe 10, 15 individuals who went for the war and who stayed there for 10, 15 years. And when they came back, they didn't have a life, and their families had changed and they couldn't basically assimilate back into the society. But like you say, and very rightly say, that Pakistan hosted 10 million Afghan refugees, and naturally the number of Afghans would have been maybe 100 times more than the individuals who went for the war. So I agree with that totally.
And then I will link up something because we should also show this development in the province over the last 10 years. And I think the decrease in some of the business activities is also might be because there are 3 million from that area that have returned. That probably also influences on the level of violence, probably also influences on the level of number of population living there. So are there other factors than those my question goes, are there other factors than that actually you have included in your research that you see also influence on the security on the borders?
As far as the industrial units things are concerned, that is how I see it. It's a simplistic sort of thing. That there is a large-scale conflict, and which you are very well aware of. So many agencies and so many areas, that are affected by military operations, and the people they are going out, and as IDPs, and they affect economic activity, and they also affect society in Northwestern Pakistan, and that is something which has gone for almost 5-6 years, since 2004 up till now, even more than that. So naturally, I think that would be the first primary reason. And in addition to that, also the Pakistani state that has not been able to dedicate sufficient resources. And the important aspect then is that liberal peace, because Pakistan received so much funding through the liberal peace framework, but it was basically in the name of Pakistan. The money basically went to humanitarian actors and bilateral actors from the West in most cases. So in spite of all those things, the critical aspect remains that why liberal peace, with all those resources, it wasn't able to effect much positive difference. So I think that is how I would see it. But but because it's a conflict-affected economy, I think that would be the first reason of the existing situation over there.
Well, there was a follow-up question from my side. It's also more to what was spoken a bit earlier, that somehow it's got not very clear for me if this is something that applies to the whole area that we studied, or if there are larger variations within. And I would assure that there is quite large differences when both come to security, and also because you stated that one of the other reasons for the escalation of the conflict is that the Pakistan failed in fulfilling its responsibility in meeting the basic needs of the inhabitants of the area. But what area are you really talking about? We're not talking about the whole province, are you?
I'm generally talking about the whole area. And when I'm talking about the whole area, I'm basically referring to the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and the FATA. So that would basically, but maybe in relation to the conflict, except Hazara and Kohistan, all the other districts which lie close to Afghanistan, they've been directly affected by the conflict. And you can see the visible impacts that the conflict has had. So in my opinion, my statement should be true for the whole area.
But if you use that as an argument for mobilization of the conflict, why don't we see more conflict in all parts of the province and only presently in Fata? And there are other elements here that maybe would not directly relate to military intervention rather than the failure of the government.
Well, it basically depends on the Pakistani state where they want to go in. So Swat was affected, Bonaire was affected. Other areas like FATA, of course, is at the center of the whole affair. But the other areas, they also feel the brunt of the conflict. Like I said, there are 600 functioning industrial units, and there were 3,500 in 2000. So it shows that as a whole, the capacity has decreased considerably, and that is pretty much visible.
Now moving towards this argument that you use as grievance, as a way of mobilizing towards joining conflict. And to me, it seems like there are some areas that there's less ground for grievance in these areas. It might be the reason why you haven't had that much of a conflict in the proper part of the province, or are you of a different opinion?
Yeah. I agree that, in FATA is a special case because, it was always left towards the back burner. An area which occupies the space between proper Pakistan and Afghanistan. It has always been seen as, whatever the military or the state authorities they do, and they can turn a blind eye and things will go on. And so I agree with your statement there that, there are different areas, like FATA is more affected and the others, they are not as affected. And in relation to the grievances are more in FATA than in proper Khyber Pakhtunkhwa.
Now there is a sentence here when we discuss this liberal peace agenda, where you say, and I quote, the liberal peace agenda indirectly contributes to the secularization of development assistance, since it forces the Pakistani military to carry out military offensive in response to US pressure. But how does the military offensive in Pakistan contribute to secularization of development assistance? I can't really see the thing.
Well, securitization of development assistance, I was having an interview with, the key provincial guy in Peshawar, and he was basically the Director General of the Provincial Disaster Management and the Rehabilitation and Settlement Authority for the IDPs. And I asked him the same thing, that, how do you connect liberal peace with, events over here? And his answer was that, because he said that, we only get funding from the US if we start military operations. That is the bargain. The bargain between us and the funders is that, they tell us that, you have to start operations. The moment we start that, then we receive funding, and the funding is basically on their own terms. So this is what maybe I'm referring to in relation to, it automatically securitizes development, because, security considerations, they are paramount. And even though development comes in, and then that is where the liberal peace thing comes in, that, it is connected with the military operations which the Pakistanis carry out.
But then we're back to where I tried to start as well, because that would go for US funding and US aid funding. I don't think it will go for funding for the UN agencies, will it?
It goes for the US aid funding, but it also goes directly towards the Pakistani government in some instances. And that is, that is sort of a gray area where the Pakistani government, it, in a way, or the ex-government, it minted money. And, that was something which was, and they would, in a way, they would put up a price tag for carrying out an operation in Northwestern, particularly, which they didn't carry out.
But if you look for funding coming through the UN, or if you look for Norwegian funding, have you seen any correlation between? So again, some of the nuances that I think it would have been better off referencing to the US pressure on part of their funding rather than make a kind of statement. Because that makes analysis such a difficult thing. Then I like to dwell a bit on two papers as well, to go in detail there. The first is actually something we have started to discuss, where I see that you paint a rather positive picture of the tribal structure, and I challenge you on that in state positions, and ability to resolve conflicts. In your last slide, you referred to changes over 4 generations that I was very happy to see. Because what I really want to challenge you on is it only what has happened with international intervention now that has challenged these structures? Or is it more changes in society? Changes among Persians, access to education, access to mobile telephones, a bit of learning of maybe like women in other places, their ability to do things, and all of these things that then together actually influences on this, not only the conflict. And then on the other side, isn't this really positive? And this positive development of Western societies, allowing from our plurality, maybe also addressing some of the wealth and power of the Khans, is not something that should be positive for the longer term level of conflict, as people might strive for more influence, more liberalism as well on their own behalf. How do you see this?
Well, you put it very well, you put very rightly. You put it up very rightly, but the point is that, the point is that yes, there have been structural changes in the Muslim society. But it is the whole set of factors. It is not just one factor. The conflict is one factor. The structural changes in the Muslim society, they are also a major factor. And they have also they have also led towards conflict. Within the present conflict, to a certain degree, they have. But, alone structure, and then structural changes also are linked with the conflict in the 80s and in the 70s in neighboring Afghanistan. So, there is a chain. But, and in the long run, maybe I would also agree with that, structural changes and, things, they can't remain, static forever. So there have to be changes within the Muslim society in the long run, but, they could be controlled, and if they still, they adhere to some of their critical values, that would probably augur well for them. because one of the primary perception locally is that, because local structures they've weakened, and they are right, because, previously one Jirga decision, it would have been enough to deal with a conflict, but right now it is not, because, the realities, local realities, they've changed. So, yeah.
No, but just a follow-up question, because if I read some of the literature on local sport correctly, what I see is it seems like there was this Taliban spot had very big troubles in mobilizing the Islamic agenda. It was when they started to talk about land reform and challenge the Khans that suddenly got protests, which to me is somehow they were not then talking about Islam, they were not talking about justice, they were talking about justice towards the tribal system and a fair distribution of land. So are some of these things that somehow the tribal structures are built on actually ready for just a modification? Other elements like this that somehow, irrespective of the war or terror or anything, actually are drivers of change within the society. And how might you best balance this? How can we reform some of these structures? I think they're good in some extent, but I think they need to reform. How can we do that?
Well, I've explored this land, this Tenant Khan conflict. In fact, I tried to explore that when I was doing my fieldwork and also the analysis. But then again, it is like, the common perception over there is basically that, the Taliban, they use the slogan, but they were not interested in basically, that was only used as a gimmick, and that was only used as a rallying call for the locals to, to displace the Khan and, to initiate the conflict. But in the long run, it is difficult, of course, I would not advocate for conservative, and I wouldn't advocate for, extreme approaches for, creating balance within the society. But I believe that, because the Pakhtun, they voted for the party of change, which is the Tehreek Insaf. So they genuinely feel that, in the long run, in the next 5 years, they will carry out legislation and they will basically make it into a role model society with reference to Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. But but there is much to be done, I would agree.
Will the Khans accept that?
Well, I hope they do.
Then a comment to the last paper, and again it's a bit overlap with what we discussed before. Some of you are critical, and you also draw on your interviews to establish the negative effect that different types of assistance have on the population, or at least you have very well identified the lack of positive effects. And then you mentioned 3 different situations. It's the earthquake, it's the floods, and it's the IDP support. And of course, then there's a bit of combination of flood and IDP support in between. But can you then, if you say that these are 3 very different categories that you actually have researched, and do you see any kind of difference in the approach to these things? Can you see a conflict that had a larger kind of influence on the approaches in some of these types of and because of what they want to get at, do you see that some of this is actually more positive than the others, where the international community in a better position to address one type of conflict, one type of resistance, and not the other, in case
from what I observed, of course, the disaster context, it was simple, comparatively simple, because, there were not as many contestations between the actors. So, the post-disaster, and then particularly since the one in Pakistan administered Kashmir, it was a simple thing. Everybody knew that, they have to provide, if they have to provide landlords, landlords over there would mean cash grants, setting up small petty businesses. But things were more different in Swat. And that also, because like you said, it was a conflict context, and then it was a flood context. And in addition, it's also the Pashtuns, they're generally difficult to work with. So,
I disagree.
so I'm just I'm trying to summarize here. So yeah, so that is that is so I think, but so it was generally difficult in the conflict context because legitimacy of actors, and then there was the Taliban, and even still, there are opposing elements and hostile actors, and then in the Pashtun society there are parallel power structures like the mosque or the power rule of the power shifted from the Hujra to the mosque, from the Khan to the Molvi. So it was slightly difficult, and it has been slightly difficult in Swat. But like you said, there are differences within the society. Large use of mobile, cell phones. Also structural changes within the society, and also women are increasingly they are seeking education, which is positive. But at the same time, there is the problem again is basically dealing with the conflict, because that has been a problem. Because if you don't deal with the conflict, you cannot shift towards long-term stability, and that has been probably a major problem.
But then I will try to draw a bit things together in my final question, because if we go back to my definition of what the difference between peacebuilding and liberal peacebuilding, the liberal is more use of military forces, a larger role for the military forces. And if we compare these three interventions, the earthquake system was led by the Pakistani military, and we used NATO helicopters to bring in supplies. And still, I think you agree, that was the best. So, what does that say about your overall discussion on the peace theory?
It's about the motives. In Northwestern Pakistan, the motive is not to deliver food or medicine. The motive is to deliver something else, which you know very well. But in Kashmir, of course, it was delivery of medicines, and of course, the military and also the Pakistani military in Kashmir, they did a commendable job. But the idea was to basically help and facilitate communities, and they didn't go in with their weapons. Whereas that is not the case when they go into Fatah. That is totally opposite. So it basically depended upon the motives, but yeah. But I agree, it's a very it's a critical point.
To me, it says that the military can hold different positions and can have different values. It's a question of what kind of tool they use that. But it doesn't always have to be negative. And more nuances to this.
Like I said, liberal peace is positive as a whole. The values are good, equality, human rights, but the way it is practiced and then practiced particularly in conflict-affected contexts, because there are geostrategic dimensions, there are political interests, and those interests, they basically they are the primary. That is what the proposers and the proponents and the funders of liberal peace they target, and in that process, then they use local communities and their opinions, and which also basically they say the winning hearts and minds campaign. That is basically that is supposed to target local communities, but it does not, because there is contradiction between the practicable approaches.
But then, if I should conclude, I would say that we should look for the positive possibilities of those who just want to have not a liberal peace, but the peace, and to see how we can work together with them and local communities. I think there is much more connections and respect for each other there, and when you have more of the international perspective and the liberal peace, of course, that you apply on the study. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And each of these objects really demand a PhD work in itself, but you may need somehow. Let's go to the US area selection. You start from the border of Afghanistan and end up the India border. So you have Peshawar Vidi, Swat Vidi, Forta, North South Waziristan, Khyber, Oman, and then why did you stick yourself so much?
First of all, I'm not basically in FATA. I've only carried out interviews in Khyber agency and in Oman agency. So I haven't basically explored all of FATA. And I basically looked at IDP returnees, IDPs who were staying in camps in Khyber and Oman. In Peshawar, in Peshawar Valley, most of my interviews I conducted in Peshawar itself. In Peshawar and a few in Charsadda, and the others were in Swat, and then of course, like you mentioned, in Kashmir, in Pakistan, I administered Kashmir and in Balapur. But because I had 4 different papers, the first paper demanded that I have a general overview of FATA, and also I have an overview of the conflict in Northwestern Pakistan. Whereas the other papers, the second paper also, by and large, was looking at the same thing. But in that paper, then I'm looking at key informants and assessing the perceptions of key informants based at Peshawar, and who generally covered the whole province. And then the third one, of course, is in Swat, and then the fourth one is in Kashmir. So it was basically the nature of my work and the nature of the objectives that I had to select these areas, but it was a challenge. It was a challenge to cover the whole area, but yeah, somehow I managed.
But when you are talking about Swat Valley, Peshawar Valley, are you talking about some issue which you actually focus on to this course, and then you find some people there, or it's kind of some criteria?
When I'm talking of the Peshawar Valley, I'm just looking at the livelihood programs in the Swat Valley. And I'm basically, I carried out interviews in 10 sets of villages throughout the Swat Valley, from the bottom till Madian. Whereas in Peshawar, of course, like I said, the second paper, it generally covered the policies pursued in Northwestern Pakistan. So that demanded that I gain understandings from informants who have an understanding of those policies and practices in Northwestern Pakistan. And they were mostly available in Peshawar, in the programs and in the UN and also other key informants.
Another thing which I was actually looking for your research approach in methodology, which was a bit difficult to find. Which kind of approach and methodology you use? You're talking about your research methods, but the broader framework is not clear. What approach you actually have?
As a whole, it's a qualitative approach. I'm basically looking at people's perceptions and basically using a semi-structured interview schedule for most of my respondents. So that, and then it's a case study approach with respect to each paper. Basically, every paper is a case study. Paper 3 is a case study of Swat. Paper 4 is a case study of Kashmir. Paper 2 is a case study of peace building, humanitarian and development responses in Northwestern Pakistan. And then, of course, paper 1 also is it's a case study of Pakhtuns, the Pakhtun society, and of Northwestern Pakistan in relation to the conflict. So that was the approach I used.
You use Croce, and which is talking about actor-oriented approach. You are also talking to different peoples, and you also development discourse is also being used and policy analysis. But there is very little in the. If you can discuss why it was.
Methodologically, like I said, it depends on which paper on the respective paper. So so every paper is basically it is utilizing somehow a similar methodology. And like paper 2, it uses a policy analysis of the policy documents and the response plans, looking at their objectives and their aims, and then also trying to break them down over time in the Northwestern Pakistan context by comparing them with the perceptions of communities in Northwestern Pakistan. But as a whole, I will accept that there is room for improvement there, and I will definitely, if I'm trying to get in a book chapter, I will work on it more.
Then on page 16, you have a table which says male, female, and then you are saying about urban, rural, and then you divide all these. I guess you have 110 total respondents, and then you divide those based on income, landlords, low income, high income, and then you also have divide those respondents based on occupation. So how can you divide these occupations like IDPs, humanitarian actors, development practitioners, police? How do you put those people in the low income or high income or middle income? Well, you have in the table you mentioned this very clearly.
I agree with that. Yeah, so some of that might be a bit blurred, but still, when I was accessing the IDP returnees and I was accessing quake-affected households, so I asked them about their income statuses, and also in my journal, in my questionnaire, and in my semi-structured interview schedule, I had a field for looking and for identifying, how people would classify that. But of course, that was based on the assets they had and the incomes they had. So if somebody was earning very low, he was in the low-income group, or he was in the low-income group, and if someone was relatively better, he was in the middle-income group, and some of the Khams and the landlords, they were in the high-income group.
Yeah, that is understandable, but which I could not understand properly was that how you divide this humanitarian actors and diplomats and journalists, police, into different income categories.
So they were basically divided in relation to the types of incomes they were having, how much they were earning, and whether they were relatively well off, or they were if they were not well off. But generally, I agree that most of them were either in the middle income group or in the upper income group, the ones who were getting more secure and better incomes.
My understanding was that probably when you're talking about humanitarian sector, so probably you have interviewed some officials which are working in those organizations, not like their income and low or high. Or for example, if you're talking about journalists, so you divide it that the journalists which have high income and then the journalists which have low income, or the diplomat which have high income and low income.
First of all, the diplomats, I think I just accessed 3 or 4, so there were very few. And whereas humanitarian program officials, I'm not sure about the number, but I used them as key informants, and I didn't use them as how. Of course, they were not household heads. So so they were, but of course, I did have an idea of whether they were part of the middle income or the upper income through the interviews.
Okay. Then you have another table on page 23 and 24, which says you are saying that 72 and key informant for article number 1, and then 16 to review transcript household informed and key informant for article 2, and then 32 for article 3, and then 44 for article 4. And then in the first articles, which is Pashtun, you only select Pashtun. Why did you select only Pashtun on Pashtun discourses?
Because I'm basically looking at FATA. I'm looking at FATA, and I'm also looking at the conflict in the Pashtun areas. So, but so in most cases they had to be Pashtuns, because I'm analyzing their social code and cultural code. So I asked them, what their understanding of their codes were, and if they attributed, the conflict to the changes in their social codes and the cultural code, which is the Pashtun Wali. So they naturally had to be Pashtuns. And then Pashtuns, probably they form the majority. They are maybe 99% in FATA. So I think so, and maybe in some of the conflict affected districts as well, they must be more than 95%. So, and that was also the focus of the paper one.
So why you are saying that they must have to be Pashtun? Why, I mean, there must be other people who have their own opinion on this discourse. Maybe outsiders, not Pashtun, maybe other Pakistanis.
The outsiders, basically what I've done is I've related to them through the mainstream perspectives on Pashtuns. And those mainstream perspectives, they are available in the media and also in the policy documents. So I'm looking at their perspectives through the literature and what I've read. And I'm presenting those things to, in a way I'm trying to deconstruct them, and I'm also trying to assess perceptions of Pashtun communities and tribal chiefs on these opinions. So this was like, so I didn't really find it important to access outsiders firsthand in relation to this, because I already had that knowledge from the literature.
And then you focus at Peshawar, you were there at Pashtun in the south also. Why didn't you find them interesting to also talk to them?
Pashtuns in the south, like I said, I used some of, again, because I had a lot of data, I have 110 respondents, and I use different sets for different papers. So Pashtuns in the south, in most cases I had interviews with them for paper one. Like Pashtuns in South Waziristan or North Waziristan or other areas of FATA, I naturally came across when I was interviewing them in Peshawar, because they are based in Peshawar. Pashtuns from all across the province, they are based in Peshawar. So I did have the opportunity to interview them. But I would agree that the focus was not as much, but then I couldn't cover all the areas. Of course, that was also a challenge.
So what you call this, when you are doing this, you are using snowball solving, and then, but this is some other kind of methods which you have used. You find people in Peshawar, where they come from, south, north, or
I used both convenience sampling and snowball sampling when I was interviewing people in Peshawar. But in case of Swat and in case of Kashmir, I stratified my sample within the different households in relation to the world wealth ranking. So like it was more a matter of convenience, and it was also a matter of snowball sampling, because I would ask my informant at the end that whom else he feels is better knowledge. For instance, if it was a humanitarian actor, or if it was a diplomat, or if it was a journalist, or if it was a professor at the university in Peshawar, I would ask him the same question, and then he would give me a few names, and then I would try to, link up with them, and then also, so this process would go on.
Then I will take a little bit of your question. On page number 17, you are saying that I already had an extensive understanding of who I was, who was relevant for this study, based on the established network of my father and trusted friends. Further, you are saying that you were in the field in October 2008 and 9, January 9, and then August 2010 and February 2011 in Swat and Kashmir, and as a participant, I was already an insider and managed to get the feeling of my respondent in the way they were viewing peace-building intervention activities. I also had a reasonable idea of what was expected in the field and how humanitarian organizations had been responding to the needs of the affected community. So you have so many declarations here, and good kind of overconfidence. Do you know the application of this kind of?
Well, to be honest, since I've been raised up in Peshawar and also like in Kohat most of my life, and then and also then my fieldwork, like for 6 months at one point of time and 3 months at another point of time. That was during that time, of course, I was only doing fieldwork and I was only carrying out interviews. with people. So that naturally, and then also because I've been following the conflict, and I started following the conflict since 2009. Basically, I started saving news events and other stories into my hard disk over here. And then I would go through and I would look through, what was happening in relation to reconstruction opportunities and in relation to conflict responses. So that all those things, they allowed me. I already knew a lot when I was basically starting my fieldwork. I knew what had happened and where it had happened, and what was going on, what were the major themes. And I was also part of humanitarian community internet group, which basically was the channel of communication between the humanitarian community in Northwestern Pakistan. So I knew the type of responses they were doing and their activities. So that is why I've made these claims. Maybe some of them are a bit excessive, but that's how I felt.
And then how you have this kind of self-reflection that you are not acting as a kind of personal activist, kind of supporting and what they are doing is good, and what kind of self-reflection you have, how you kind of play this role that you are not...
That was probably the most difficult part of my study, because it was difficult if you are so closely tied with a particular context, and then, so I did try, and then also my advisors over here, they were quite helpful in that aspect, basically forcing me and pushing me to rethink and think. So, but that was a challenge, but I was also thinking, and of course, I was also getting comments on the articles. So from journals, so that was helpful, but it was slightly difficult. But since the focus of the study is to basically assess, why conflict is taking place in the area and how it is connected with, decreased influence from local structures. So it was natural for me to take a position, in that direction. But it was I would agree that it was difficult.
And related to this question, which I also mentioned, was you have differently, you talk about Fatah, and you are talking about Peshawar Valley, and then you are talking about Swat Valley, and then Kashmir. And all these different areas have different governance systems. So, but I could not find any complete kind of the governance structure and system, how they are operating, because it also has to do with the intervention of the humanitarian organization and NGOs and government departments.
I agree with that to a certain extent, but like the title of my thesis is basically the focus is on Northwestern Pakistan. So the fourth paper, I'm just using a comparison to look into, since I'm trying to compare livelihoods in different contexts and livelihood revivals. So that is what I'm using the fourth paper for. So the overwhelming focus, of course, remains on Northwestern Pakistan, which is basically Swat, Peshawar, and these two agencies from Fatah. So I don't think there is, like, in that perspective, I don't think so. There is so much. There shouldn't be a big problem in generalizing across Northwestern Pakistan. And also, since I'm generalizing livelihoods in two different contexts, but I would agree. But then again, they were the only two contexts available. Like in Pakistan, they were available to me to compare Swat with the other contexts. But I would agree that the responses took place at different points of time. But still, they do outline reasons for success of livelihood interventions and programs.
Because in Fatah you have this Malik system, and there is different land use pattern, and then in Swat you have this arm system, landlords, but in Peshawar really you have a different system, and Kashmir and Maksera, where you also work, is a quite different system, although they are all in the Northwest Pakistan.
I agree with that, but still, like I said earlier, that the papers, they focus on different issues, and like the last two papers, they are looking at different sub-areas, sub-study areas. So there are issues in basically generalizing, but still, they do give a relative degree of comparison. Paper 3 and 4 and the others as well. But as a whole, it is a Pashtun society. It is a Pashtun society, and they respect Pashtun culture and Pashtun social codes. Maybe in FATA they were more effective at some point of time, and maybe they are not as practiced in Peshawar, but they still form basis of the society in Peshawar, and they also form basis of the society in the Swat. In Swat, so there are strong links. It's the same ethnic group. Maybe there are Khans in Swat and there are Maliks in FATA, but Maliks occupy the same position as the Khans occupy in Swat. Maybe the Maliks are more assertive, but you see that in the present conflict, the role of the Malik has also decreased.
Yeah, you also mentioned this Pashtun faction. You are saying Khan, and then you have Mullah, and then the tenants, and another one was? Yeah. So my question is actually, when you are declaring it for the whole Pashtun society, I'm not a Khan, I'm not a member, although I regret, but I'm not a Mullah. So where do you put me? And that's the definition of Pashtun.
So you are there's a fourth class, Kasabgan, and that means the working class. So I think, in my opinion, you are there.
And then you mentioned that the aid, the money which we are getting in Pakistan, all the money is coming through liberal peace agenda, or there is also a humanitarian aid, like what comes in the earthquake area and in the flood affected area. Can we combine these two things? Are they same?
It depends, when you receive the money. If the Pakistanis, they are getting this support in a conflict-affected context, then obviously it has strong connections with liberal peace. But like you said, it's difficult to classify. If this is liberal peace and if this is not liberal peace. But liberal peace as a whole is a framework which analyzes, post-conflict rebuilding and post-conflict institutions and donor assistance. So in cases where there is a flood, maybe in the south, in Sindh, then probably that is not directly liberal peace. But still, it might still have some of its objectives and aims. They will be connected. The ultimate aim from the donor is to see civil societies and to see some of their goals. That is something which they would naturally like.
My next question is that, as I mentioned, the governance system in the different areas, the same goes for the humanitarian aid, because you are working in Fata and then in Swat and also in the earthquake affected areas. It would have been far better if you would also explain what kind of humanitarian aid and how they intervene in earthquake affected area, and then how did they intervene in the flood affected area, and how did they intervene in the conflict affected area, which is both conflict and then floods, and how they are doing in the Fata, which is only flood affected area. Because in the earthquake, it was only ERA and PERA who, through RB, which you also mentioned, have a good intervention as per your findings. But in SWAT, there was a different kind of institutional setup, which was done through PARSA. And then the PARSA was still going on, then the flood came, and then it was a different system again, which was done by PDMA or NDMA. So it's very difficult to say that liberal peace is unless you really explain this, that what happened in the earthquake affected area, what was the response in the flood, and what was the response of the conflict, and what is still the response in the water.
I agree to this, but you But again, Swat is a conflict-affected area. Kashmir is not a conflict-affected area. There was no conflict. It was a post-disaster reconstruction effort. So naturally, like I said earlier, that conflict-affected contexts, they will have more similarities with the peace frameworks. But maybe there should have been greater clarity. There is always room for improvement. So I will, in the future, I will make note of that.
Yeah, because this also brings me to the last two articles, which I will be have some question on. You are comparing the livelihood revival and earthquake-affected area with the SWAT area. Kashmir and the SWAT. But you see, the earthquake came in 2005, October 2005, and you worked there in October 2008, 3 years after the earthquake. And it was just a matter of minutes and seconds, and then go upside down, and then the next minutes people start rescuing, relief, and then relief and livelihood, revival kind of activities. But in SWAT, the conflict is still there. So the conflict started in 2009, and then it was still, you start working there, and then the flood came in 2010. So there was no space for the revival of livelihood, because people were still struggling with the relief activity, rescue kind of operation. So, and then you are saying that the livelihood revival of recovery is almost failed in SWAT, because they never started it. So how can you say that they have failed? There has been...
In SWAT, you're very right when you say you present these different timelines. But it must be, it's quite clear that areas in SWAT that were affected by the flood, they were close to the river. They were close to the river. They were close to the river, and they were adjacent to the river. My fieldwork was basically in September 2010, and the IDPs, they returned in 2009 August in SWAT. So the conflict-affected villages in most cases, they were not as much affected by the floods. Only a few villages in the north, I interviewed people where they were also affected by the floods. So my focus basically was on the conflict. And in those areas, basically, I was asking them about the schemes that had been taking place immediately after the conflict. But I agree that, the space which was there in SWAT was 1.5 year, almost a quarter year old, 1 year, and in Kashmir it was like 2.5, 3 years almost. So there was different in relation to time, there were differences, different timelines. But still, like I said, my selection of the selection of villages were basically based on whether they were marginally affected by the conflict or whether they were largely affected by the conflict, and they were far away from the river. So I could basically ask those communities and households the type of support they received through livelihood programs after the rehabilitation phase was over. And the rehabilitation and relief phase, that is supposed to basically last for 3 months. So naturally, you had to expect that livelihood activities, they should have been carried out in the long run. But I would agree that it is difficult to generalize. It is not so easy.
Because even now there is a tension between the government and the humanitarian agency. The government is still trying to persuade the humanitarian agency that you have really to have work on the livelihood and reconstruction. But they are still doing relief activities, which is almost like, because you see why I'm asking this, there was no space. People were still trying to have relief activity for the conflict-affected area. While they were doing this, suddenly the flood came. And then humanitarian agencies or the government had no opportunity, no time to actually think about and practically implement the livelihood projects. So, then it's a bit difficult to look into something which is probably not that much there.
I agree with that. I agree with that. that, but yeah, I do agree that it was difficult because it was a huge flood, and it had lots of impacts, and it also, like you mentioned, that the PDMA came in instead of PARSA, but yeah, so they were fundamental issues, but still you could generalize to a degree, and of course activities had been taking place. And then the other point is that my fieldwork was from September to up to February 2011. So I was there for 6 months. So I continued interviews till the end, till February 2011. So that gave me that space. That provided me maybe a space of a year and a half since the conflict was over. But I would agree that because SWAT is a complicated case. So there was a flood as well, and I also, yeah, so...
Did you also mention that, because in the SWAT case, when the flood came after the conflict, so things were almost flushed out, and then the water was going down in the down countries, and donors and humanitarian agencies were actually following the water, and they left SWAT. And that could also be one reason that when you are concluding that it was a failure, but you should have also touched on this thing, that why it was so.
For paper 2, basically, I take the post-crisis needs assessment. The post-crisis needs assessment, which is a long-term rehabilitation strategy, and implemented since 2009, something like that, onwards. And it has specific goals for the whole of Northwestern Pakistan. So I'm trying to basically trace the objectives and the aims that strategy had generally, and what it wanted to achieve. But yeah, but that is like you said, that is a different issue. That the water was going, and it was a huge crisis. It was a massive crisis, and that is not easy to deal with.
But methodologically, when you are saying you were focusing on crisis, the conflict, which was dealt by PARSA, but when the flood came, there was another organization who were dealing with the flood damages, which was not PARSA. And if you would ask PARSA that the bridges is gone and all these things, so they say, no, we have nothing to do with that. We are only dealing with the conflict. So how do you differentiate? Because you have 11 villages in SWAT, and some of those villages were affected first by conflict and later on by floods. So how do you focus? They only talk on conflict, not on flood. And then when you are particularly talking about the livelihood, which is affected both by conflict and flood as well.
Like I said, like a few villages in Madian which I selected. Madian is a short valley, maybe 5 kilometers narrow, and then the river, it had taken away most of the land and most of the terraces. So I had basically both these issues would come up in Madian and in the 3 villages which I accessed in Madian. But in central SWAT and in lower SWAT, I selected Kanju and some other areas. Some of them like Shore Valley, which is in the mountains. So but I agree with your point that the flood was also a critical issue. But when I was going into the field, we decided that I will look into the effects of the flood, but my whole focus will still remain the conflict, because it was not possible for me to explore each and every dimension. But so that's why I basically chose interventions following the conflict.
Yes, on the gender part, which you also took very well, but in Article 3, you have 20 quotations, very long quotations from different people. And I was really disappointed that I found only one from people, and the rest were all from men. And this is one thing, but you did all your interview on your own. So I was wondering, how did you find this a young man talking to children? How did you really extract what was in their hearts and minds, being a man and working in a conservative society,
accessing women was a challenge, and particularly it was a huge challenge in SWAT. When I started in September 2010, I remember, there were so many checkpoints, maybe 30 to 40, when I would just visit, or when I would just try to cross the SWAT valley, I would find a checkpost after every 500 meters. And it was actually, I concealed my identity at the time, because it would have been very problematic, because the military was there. So it was almost impossible for me to interview a woman at the time. And then you know the Pashtun society very well. But at the end, I had the opportunity, because I was working through local NGOs, and they had provided grants and other types of support. So basically, I relied upon them, but it was not difficult, because they would introduce me, and then I would ask a question, and sometimes we would sit in focus groups, and then I would basically ask them the same question to each and every respondent. So they were free to talk, and I had lengthy sessions. But if I haven't used some of that data, the reason for that may be because I would basically look for new issues. If I received a particular response, and if that response remains the same in the other interviews, I would just say that most of the respondents said this. So that is also one reason maybe why I just have a few quotes from women.
Yeah, I'm running out of time, but one maybe second last question. When you are saying this liberal peace is a kind of video, it's not concerning the local community, but in SWAT, particularly in conflict area, most of the intervention was actually implemented through local partner, which is local organization. Very few humanitarian organization came to SWAT and they worked quickly. It was done through local NGOs and community organizations. But you didn't talk on those organizations, because it was, this is why I asked in the beginning that there was different structural mechanism when it comes to implementation of humanitarian response, where in SWAT, programs were implemented through cluster, where there were the participant, the representative of the government, also the local organization, the NGOs, different. So,
in that aspect, what I would like to say is, because, like I said earlier, I was part of the humanitarian community group. So even though if projects, they had local partners, the way the vetting of the proposals was carried out, and the way, project proposals were accepted, I was basically witnessing most of those through the internet group where I was a member. And I've seen that, they would just send out calls, and they would say that, we need proposals, we need, 40 potential proposals for 40 projects within 24 hours. So, and then also PDMA and FARSA, they had very little leverage, because, the money was directly going from the donor to those local partners. So in many cases, the PDMA and the PARSA, which is the local provincial organization, they even didn't give those NGOs NOCs. And there was lots of duplication. But the point I want to make is, the process was carried out so haphazardly that, of course, the results would be not very beneficial. And it was basically done, like in most cases, from the liberal, from donors and others. Whereas in Kashmir, there was a central authority, there was ERA, and the money was coming to ERA, and ERA had a say. And that is also maybe the difference in that case.
Yeah, it's quite difficult to rely on internet group how things were organized, but you divide your respondents into different groups: low income, middle income, men and women. But when you're writing, it's so difficult to find out who said what. Which group has what kind of opinion? What is the kind of perception, understanding of men and female? What is the understanding, perceptions of donors, or police, security people, or low-income people, middle-income people, high-income people? So it's quite
my thesis, I think paper 3, it is more clearer in comparison to the other 3 papers when you're trying to break down the respondent in relation to occupation and the other classifications which you've pointed out. But it also basically, since when you're trying to publish, you're basically looking at the journal, and that also determines the types of, like, of course it's my own work, but it has been revised multiple times. So I tried my level best, to analyze the data and code all the transcriptions and look through. But maybe I could have even done that better. So I would agree with that point.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have you flipped a little bit?
Almost. Nästan. Finito?